There once was a land that was covered with emerald hills, abundant fields, and dense whispering forests. In this realm, two kingdoms ruled side by side that had formed an alliance, and they were very close. The kingdoms were also equally powerful. The two kingdoms flourished side by side. Each was a jewel in its own right. One family had a daughter, and the other had a son. The two families had betrothed the couple, and in the meantime the young prince and princess were taught etiquette and other important lessons they would need for their future. Unfortunately, before the girl's parents could see her grow into a beautiful woman, they were swiftly taken away from this plane in a horrific carriage accident, leaving the princess vulnerable, sad, and alone. Her kingdom council advised the other ruling king and queen that they should quickly marry the young couple. Each would benefit greatly. The king said that the couple would still be betrothed, but the young girl was not ready to join his family just yet. He had to make sure that she learned all that she needed to. The queen took the orphan princess under her wing and began teaching her. In the meantime, the young prince followed his father around to learn the ropes. As for the young woman's kingdom, the king took over the deed as a precautionary measure. This would be used to ensure the young princess stayed loyal to the cause. She would be family one day. It was best to get everything in order for that time. The young princess was reluctant to agree at first, but they persuaded her by saying that it would make things easier. It would also secure her safety. As time went by, the young girl grew up, and the old king and queen grew old and passed away. She thought it would soon be her time to reign next to the king. For a few years they spent time courting, and she developed new skills she never knew she had. She was able to manifest what she put her mind to. She also began to spoil her future king, showering him with love and gifts, and she also manifested his safety in battle. She used her mind to make him even more rich and powerful. During that time, he sent away all the staff that lived in her castle, and it became an abandoned shell. It was no longer the masterpiece it once was. The princess was emotional, but she knew she had to let it go so she could nurture a life where she was at. She was almost done learning how to be a queen, and she would take her position next to the king, so he said. Over the years the king fought and won many battles. He said he couldn't get married until the fighting had somewhat ceased. Her intuition told her something was amiss. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach, but she convinced herself that he was probably right. Of course he wanted her. She was a divine feminine that was intuitive and compassionate. She also had helped him double his fortune. She was somewhat of an alchemist, and her powers were only getting stronger. So she waited. After all, she was comfortable and living a lavish lifestyle. She served her king by clearing his energy and making sure he stayed positive. She supported him, and when he needed her to manifest riches beyond his belief, all he had to do was ask. She kept herself busy by strengthening her own internal gifts as well. She learned spirituality and other subjects, and her knowledge grew. As for the king, with every battle he won, his army grew stronger and more ruthless. Soon he conquered the surrounding area, and his influence was spreading across the land. She wanted to celebrate with him, but his attitude began to change. In the past they would talk in his room for hours. After winning past wars, he would hug her and spend time with her. But lately, he just wanted to drink with his army for days. She sat in her room and listened to the drums and cheering men. From high in her tower, she could see the bonfire they all sat around. She knew things were changing, so she meditated and tried to think about a solution to her problems. She wondered why he was no longer loving and attentive, though. The next day, she saw a few women come to the courtyard and enter the castle. She followed them from a distance as they went inside and up the stairs. They disappeared into his chambers, and then her heart began to jump in her chest. How could he do this? The princess didn't confront the king, but throughout the season, she saw more women enter her territory. She realized she was merely a concubine in his eyes, not a consort. She didn't even think he liked her, since he grew ever more greedy, ungrateful, and demanding. He only wanted gold, not her hand in marriage or a loving relationship. The emotional bond they briefly shared in the past faded, and he was no longer available for her. She wondered if what they shared was a negative emotional attachment on her side. Maybe he never planned on being with her. He only came to her when it benefited himself. Basically, she was a prisoner in the palace and forced to be his slave for her magical powers. She felt like a bird locked in a cage, lonely and neglected. Her once loving demeanor turned wild and savage when she thought of him. She began to hate him, and she wanted to leave. So she pulled out her trunk and started to pack. That night when she tried to load the carriage and leave, the king saw her and forced her back into her room. He threw her trunk inside and locked her in. He noticed at that moment that her loyalty was no longer with him. Now she really was a prisoner. For months she slowly refused to help him or produce treasures. He felt the impact of her decision, and he responded by acting ill-mannered. Over a short amount of time, he grew sick and irritable. The longer she withheld her energy, the stronger she got, and she plotted her next moves to escape his grasp. He stole her independence, but the isolation helped her gain clarity and strength. She denied superficial duties and desires and focused on empowering her strength, spirituality, and core knowledge. She was no longer at his beck and call, submissive or kind. He grew scared of her behavior towards him and the loss of her favor. He was bleeding money and couldn't generate income as fast as it disappeared. His money quickly dwindled. Without her loving services, he forgot how to take care of himself, and no one, not even his staff, could replace her loving attention. Now he lacked in many areas of his life. He also grew colder towards everyone in the kingdom. His attitude repelled the staff, and they refused to stay and work. He realized the princess was his lifeline. Without her, he was lost and cursed. Through her powerful love, he was spiritually protected. And without her to cover him, he was unable to heal himself, save his bloodline, or save himself. His bad deeds came to haunt him, and dark forces crept into his life. It corrupted his mind, and he grew paranoid and wicked. Karma came to confront him and show him her wrath. It was something he wasn't prepared for. He was also faced with the task of finding a quick way to make money. He feared karma, but not as much as he feared losing his money. So he set out to try and defeat a smaller kingdom. But he failed tremendously and lost a quarter of his army. He returned home and drank in his room. He no longer had offerings from above, and his throne was in danger of becoming insecure. He couldn't afford to lose any more battles or finances. Somehow he grew greedier and needier. He was no longer the charming man he used to be. The princess had helped him rise, and he single-handedly created his own downfall. He didn't see it before, but her role in his life was crucial, and he disrespected it. All the ones he left her for were gone now, and he too was left alone. Famine and disease stretched across the land when he neglected his position, power, mental health, and the ones who used to love him. He went downstairs to sit on his decrepit throne and continued to ponder his life choices. He drank himself into a stupor and argued with seemingly imaginary foes. His inner demons made their presence and taunted him. The princess sat in her room and thought about how badly the king had messed everything up. He no longer had guidance or anyone to give him good advice, and he couldn't rely on his own jaded common sense. Then she thought about her own mistakes. She had once saw herself as a unique and privileged gem that he could adore, but she knew she had been blinded by love. He took advantage of her and changed her mindset. The princess also saw him for the cruel, tyrannical ruler that he really was. His true colors shine through. He used her, but she didn't need him. She was capable of creating a happy life for herself. She was better without him. When he manipulated her, she was weak and naive. But she changed. There was no excuse for what he did. His calculated, strategic actions drained her for years until she woke up. Now she could have the peace she desired. She just had to leave this tower. She brought herself out of her sad, depressed, broken state and stepped into an angry, vengeful, powerful disposition. She would use everyone's emotions and weaknesses against them from this point forward, or at least while she was in this castle. That would be her only way out. She sat quietly on her bed and devised a plan. Suddenly it came to her, but she would have to wait a couple of hours to put it into effect. She giggled to herself. This had to work. That night, as one of the last working servants came to deliver her supper, she used her cunning skills and sensuous nature to seduce him. The princess encouraged him to come forward. When he did, She knocked him out with a nearby vase. She packed a few necessities into a pillowcase and ran out of the tower. She snuck through the back stairway in the castle and towards the exit. Speedily, she ran through the property in the cover of the darkness. The princess cried as she ran into the forest. She didn't know what would happen if she got caught. She didn't know the king anymore. For days she ran without taking many breaks. She wanted to get deep into the forest. One day, she sat down to breathe. She ate nuts that fell from the trees. But she needed to find some water. She was growing weaker and her body ached. She had foraged the forest many times in order to find herbs for her benefit. But she never needed to venture far or search for water. She knew there was a river. But she didn't know how long it would take her to get there. The princess headed in that direction and tried to get water from the plants around her as she walked. It took many days for her to reach the river, and she was exhausted. She rested there and regained her energy. When she got bored, she looked at the foliage near her. She tested her knowledge and identified the herbs she recognized. This was something she was good at and could see herself doing in the future. A few birds and chipmunks came into the area and watched her. The princess didn't scare them away, so they lingered. She laughed as she watched how they behaved. They were kind of funny. When they suddenly ran, she hid and listened closely. She heard gunshots in the distance. So she ran in the river until her feet hurt too much to continue. She collapsed on the shore and tried to catch her breath. She took a drink of water and looked up at the sky. It was getting dark again, and the princess lost track of how long she had been gone. She wasn't sure who shot the gun, but she assumed it was the angry king. But it could have been a hunter. She kept moving, and her brain was on autopilot. She ate, drank, and took short naps, but she never got a full night's rest. One day she met an older woman who took her in and hid her well. The princess had explained her dilemma, and she promised she wouldn't stay long. She said she was trying to get out of the king's reach. The king had something else in mind. He was in fact on her trail, and his henchmen were with him. They scoured the forest with trackers and dogs. They left destruction behind them as they cut down plants and trees to uncover potential hiding spots. To his dismay, he didn't locate the princess. He knew he was running out of time, and his resources relied on her return. The king moved impulsively now, and without her light, he grew darker and more disturbing. He grew desperate, and he craved her essence and capabilities. He couldn't understand how she generated wealth and commanded others without abusing her power, or how she embraced others with love and kindness so easily. What no one told him was that her powers worked for her because she was generous, pure, innocent, loving, and kind, and that he was forbidden to have those capabilities since he was greedy, lustful, and evil. He didn't even notice that he was getting more spiteful and jealous. He prevented himself from creating his own magic because he was focused on the wrong things. All that made him more dangerous. He searched the land but couldn't find her. His energy began to fade, and fear took its place. His men told him about a cottage they saw up ahead, and the king smiled. Then they all went to the location with plans to enter it with or without permission. They knocked politely, but the woman inside already knew why they were there. She opened the door kindly and allowed them to come and sit. She knew if she entertained them, the princess could gain distance. So, the old woman made a stew, laid out some blankets for them to sleep, and started a fire. She went outside and prepared wood for the rest of the men that couldn't fit in her house. She conversed with the men and told funny, light-hearted stories to distract them. When darkness came and the food was done, she served them and opened a few small barrels of aged ale she had saved for special occasions. The group of men ate the food and drank for the remainder of the night. The king reclined by the fire, but he couldn't shake a suspicious feeling. He asked the woman if she saw the princess, and she said she hadn't. The king didn't believe her, so he interrogated her some more. He wasn't sure why he thought she was lying, but it irritated him. She continued to deny the accusations, and hours later, she politely excused herself. That move felt offensive to the king. How dare she remove herself while he was questioning her? That would be the only time she disrespected him. As the men prepared to leave the next morning, the king asked one man to stay behind and take care of the woman, and send her off to her maker. Then the man was ordered to return to the group once the deed was done. After many days of traveling, the princess made it to a new land that looked like paradise. She felt hopeful that she could begin a new life there. The area had a small village, and she had passed fields of crops growing on the way. She had followed the river to get there, so it had plenty of water, and it was sheltered by the forest. It was a quaint, cozy location. She made her way to a tiny inn. The princess didn't have money, but she handed the owner the silver tiara that she had in her sack. It was sufficient payment for a couple of days. That was plenty of time for her. The princess made plans to forage for herbs and offer medicinal concoctions to the villagers. She went to her room to drop off her sack. Then she spent the day foraging for ingredients. She just needed to find a place to prepare some of her creations and find containers to put them in. She used her imagination and came up with some decent ideas. She used simple methods for potent formulations. In her room, she used tools to grind dried leaves and bark. She separated petals from flowers. The next day she took her remedies to the local market and advertised her offerings verbally. She was able to attract a small crowd, and she sold out of her products. The next day she did the same thing, and the crowd grew bigger. She repeated the process daily and added more items each time she returned. She brought better containers she bought from the local potter. She formed a bond with him and got discounts. Then she started buying in bulk. She saved her money and searched for housing outside of town. She came across a tiny house near the river that was perfect for her. She just needed a little more money. So she put more effort into her business until she could afford the purchase. She had never lived alone or bought anything for herself. It felt refreshing. She would finally be able to settle down and live her own life with freedom. In the back of her mind, she was afraid that the king would find her, but she wasn't sure if he would be able to. She hoped he would give up on trying to get to her. Maybe he already had let it go. He had a kingdom to run, so he couldn't follow her forever. The king had searched for her for many weeks, but he turned around when his trackers couldn't pick up her scent. He was frustrated, but he needed to return to the castle. However, he ordered sentries and trackers to keep searching for her. Some sentinels were ordered to search every settlement within the kingdom. For months she stayed low-key, but she started to get popular within the village. A young man always stopped by her booth and made small talk. But over time he showed more interest and became her friend. Then he expressed that he wanted more. She knew he had good intentions, and he was very kind. But she wasn't ready to get close to someone again. He respected her wishes, but he still hung around her in case she changed her mind and because he liked her companionship. He knew he fell in love at first sight, and he would wait for her to feel completely comfortable with him. The truth was that she had already fallen for him. But she was afraid to get hurt, and she was scared that the king would find them. She didn't want to draw any attention to herself or bring anyone else into her situation. However, it was very difficult to fight off the feelings that were growing inside of her. She had a soft spot for the man who kept visiting her. He was very handsome and nice. She felt like he was authentic, transparent, and honest. The other villagers liked him, and he had a good head on his shoulders. To her, that was refreshing. At the castle, everyone was fake, and they only said things you wanted to hear. Day by day, the princess tried to deny her feelings for the man, until one day her heart won. She accepted the man into her life, and they grew closer. She prayed for their safety every night before going to bed. She begged God to cloak her from evil and keep the king away from her and the man. She felt like her prayers were working, because a whole season had passed without any danger. The princess relaxed, but she kept praying. The couple's love grew stronger, and the man moved into her home. Every day they worked on her business, and every night they cuddled by the fireplace. Life was good. She even grew more radiant as the stress faded from her life. She received compliments from everyone. News began to spread about a beautiful young medicine woman with healing powers. Behind her back, men told myths about the princess in taverns across the area. They said there was a beautiful goddess with unique mystical powers to cure any ailment and give you eternal life. Some joked that they would kidnap her and keep her to themselves. The princess didn't know about the rumors, but she knew she was beginning to have some alarming dreams. They started coming every few weeks, but now she was plagued by them every other night. She knew there was a message in them, but she couldn't decipher what it was. The princess thought it was about the king, but the dreams were about death, and that can come from anything. She only saw her and the man lying dead, but she couldn't tell what hurt them. She wondered if they were sick, so she made powerful potions to aid their immune systems. She kept her distance from others in town while she was working, and she made sure both of them got plenty of good food and rest. Then she meditated and prayed daily. She sat alone by the river often and tried to use her intuition and other gifts to see the future, but she couldn't receive any messages. All she could do was prepare for the worst. She considered leaving her man or running away with him and leaving this life behind, but she didn't know how to explain her fears to him. She didn't tell him who she really was. To him, she was simply a merchant, not a princess with an angry, jealous king on her trail. She wondered if she'd convince him to leave without telling him her secrets. She loved this man with all her heart, but she felt compelled to go. Yet, she couldn't bear to leave him. She was conflicted with too many issues to think clearly. She wasn't even sure why she felt this way. She didn't even have proof that she wasn't being paranoid. Unfortunately, he sensed her turmoil and couldn't understand what had her so flustered and anxious. When he asked what was affecting her, she didn't have time to think of a good answer. She shrugged, smiled, and said she was in pain from working so much. He didn't believe her, but he said he loved her. She loved hearing those words, but this time it scared her. She couldn't even think about losing him. Then she had an idea. She told him they needed to go to the coast. She said she needed herbs and salt for her pain, and that they needed to leave that night. She started to pack quickly, and he was confused, but he followed her lead. The ocean was a few weeks away, and she assumed the king would never find her there. She could live off the land and sea and find adequate shelter. It would also save their lives. After supper, when the sun went down, the couple made their way into the forest and towards the sea. The couple traveled as far as they could each day. They only rested when they couldn't possibly move forward for one reason or another. They were exhausted by the time they made it to the coast. They looked for shelter inside of a deep cave, and she felt safe. For months they were happy living by the ocean and eating supper together by a fire every night. She gathered seaweed, shells, and more from the area. The medicine she made actually did help her bones, and the peace helped her mental well-being. Eventually they met a few people in a small town and joined the community. She sold her joint medication to the townspeople, and months later the couple had a small wedding ceremony. They each made a couple close friends. Her man suggested that they build a tiny home by the beach, and she agreed. They did need better shelter. It would also be easier for her to prepare her medicine. For a year they lived a normal, quiet life in their small cottage. She grew a small garden and raised chickens she got from town. Then one night a devastating storm hit, and it brought with it an ominous feeling. She felt like the storm wasn't the only thing to destroy parts of this town. She felt like something else was coming closer. She looked up at the gray clouds after the storm passed. The sun was coming out, but she didn't feel any better. A chilly wind blew in, and she wrapped herself in a shawl. She watched the waves crash, and suddenly the princess felt her husband's strong arms caress her as he held her from behind. Then he asked her what was wrong. She couldn't lie, but she couldn't speak the truth, so she turned and gave him a hug. A captain had come into town and saw her. He was captivated by her beauty and couldn't forget it. He talked about her everywhere he went. He spoke of the sea siren that actually existed, and he knew where she lived. The sentinels recognized her description from the way the man described her in a tavern one night. Then they relayed the message to the king. The ruler was obsessed and fueled by anger to hear that she had been trying to live a normal, happy life with another man, and that she left him in her dust. He packed his horses and men that night and headed to the coastal town. All week the rain came and went, and so did her fears. She suggested that they take shelter in the cave for better protection. Again, her husband agreed. They brought provisions and headed towards their temporary home. They stayed there until they heard the sound of people talking loudly on the beach. When the princess came out and looked, the people pointed towards the ocean. A few massive ships lurked just beyond the bay. Everyone kept an eye on the fleet. There was nothing they could do about the visitors, but they were curious about what they wanted. There were only a few reasons why a fleet of ships would even be traveling. The princess wondered if the men were in alliance with the king. Had they come here for her? She wished she could be happy and release the fight, flight, or freeze response she was perpetually dealing with. It prevented her from thinking clearly, and she could feel the effect the stress had on her mind, body, and spirit. A few days later, the men climbed on dinghies and made their way to shore. They made a huge bonfire and sat near it. The more comfortable they got, the more uneasy the princess felt. She wasn't alone. The townspeople stayed inside their homes and waited for the men to move on. The fact that the men weren't in a hurry to cause destruction also made the princess question their intentions. Were they merely stepping on land for a minute, or were they here for something else? A couple of days later, the princess heard a commotion on shore. The king she was running from and a group of his men came to the beach. Her heart stopped as they yelled at the men from the ship. He assumed they were there because of her. In his evil mind, he thought everyone was against him. He confronted the men and a fight ensued. Now each of the men were embroiled in deadly combat. Neither side was fighting for the correct reason. The king thought the men were there because of her, and the other side thought they were being ambushed by the king and his men for coming to his kingdom. In the end, the evil king and his men lay dying on the damp shore. The princess stood with her mouth ajar. Her husband was by her side. They had just witnessed the death of the king. To her, he was simply a tyrant. She was crying tears of joy because now she was free. She could stop running. She could also tell her husband who she really was without fear. As she explained her emotions and the situation, he told her she was no longer a princess, but she had been a queen since her parents' death. It was obvious, but it didn't hit her until he spoke it out loud. She had been living in survival mode for so long that she forgot who she was. She cried even harder, and she asked him what he wanted to do. He said they could go back to her kingdom now. And that's exactly what they did.